Let me ask you something. We tend to think history started with the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the people who left us pyramids and marble statues and tidy little written records. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Every single one of those famous civilizations was already standing on the shoulders of people who came thousands of years before them. People with no writing, no metal, sometimes no farming. And yet they pulled off things that genuinely shouldn't have been possible. Today, I want to take you back past the edge of recorded history, into the deep dark, to 10 cultures that rewired what it means to be human. And trust me, number 1 is going to mess with your sense of time completely. Let's go. Number 10, the Clovis people of North America. Picture the New World around 13,000 years ago. A frozen, untouched continent. Mammoths and giant ground sloths and short-faced bears the size of a small car roaming everywhere. And into this walks a group of humans armed with what might be the most beautiful stone tool ever made, the Clovis point. Now I know stone spearhead doesn't sound thrilling, but stay with me. These things are works of art. Long, leaf-shaped, fluted down the middle so they'd lock onto a wooden shaft. Napped with a precision that modern flint knappers still struggle to copy. For decades, the Clovis were considered the very first Americans. Full stop. The textbook answer. And what blows my mind is how fast they spread. Within just a few centuries, near identical points show up from Canada all the way down to Mexico. That's a culture moving across an entire continent at a sprint. Now, honestly, the first Americans' crown has slipped a bit lately. There's growing evidence of people here before Clovis, and we'll get to that. But here's the darker part of the story. Right around the time the Clovis were thriving, the great megafauna of North America vanished. The mammoths, the mastodons, gone. Was it these hunters? Was it climate? The scientists still argue about it, and there's no clean answer. But imagine being part of the culture that may have watched, or even caused, the disappearance of the largest animals your continent would ever see. That's a heavy inheritance to leave behind in a handful of stone points. Number 9, the Jomon of ancient Japan. So here's a question that should bother you more than it does. Who invented pottery? Most people would guess some farming village in the Middle East. Wrong. The oldest pottery we've found comes from the Jomon people of Japan. And the kicker, the part I love, is that they made it while they were still hunter-gatherers. We've got Jomon pottery shards pushing back 16,000 years, maybe more. Think about how strange that is. The whole tidy story we tell ourselves goes, first you invent farming, then you settle down, then you get pots to store your grain. The Jomon ripped that script in half. They never bothered with agriculture for the longest time because, frankly, they didn't need to. Japan's coastlines and forests were so rich with fish, nuts, and game that they could settle down, build villages, and craft elaborate pottery while still fishing and foraging for their dinner. And these weren't crude bowls. The name Jomon literally means cord-marked after the gorgeous rope patterns they pressed into the wet clay. They lived this way, settled, artistic, comfortable, for over 10,000 years. 10,000. That's not a phase. That's one of the longest-running continuous cultures in all of human history. And it makes me wonder how many of our rules about how civilization is supposed to develop are just stories we made up because they fit the few examples we happen to dig up first. Number 8. The Natufians of the Levant. Let me set the scene. Around 14,000 years ago, in the lands that are now Israel, Jordan, Syria, there lived a people who were standing right on the knife's edge between two completely different ways of being human. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers, but they did something almost nobody had done before. They stopped wandering. They built round stone houses and actually stayed put, year-round, before farming even existed. And honestly, this is one of those moments that quietly changed everything. Because once people stop moving, everything else follows. They buried their dead carefully, sometimes decorated with seashells and ornaments. They harvested wild cereals with little flint sickles. You can still see the telltale sheen on the blades from cutting grass stems. They were basically farming's dress rehearsal. And here's the detail that gets me. Some researchers think it was a harsh, cold snap. a 1,000-year-long climate downturn that pushed these settled people to start deliberately planting the wild grains they'd been gathering. In other words, agriculture, the single invention that would lead to cities, kings, writing, taxes, war, all of it, may have been born not out of genius, but out of desperation. The Natufians didn't know they were lighting the fuse on the entire modern world. They were just trying to get through a bad winter that lasted 10 centuries. Number 7. The builders of Çatalhöyük. Now, we jump to central Turkey, around 9,000 years ago, to one of the strangest towns ever built. Çatalhöyük was home to maybe 5,000 to 8,000 people, which for that era is enormous, a genuine proto-city. But here's where it gets wonderfully weird. There were no streets, none. The houses were packed together like cells in a honeycomb, wall to wall, and you didn't walk between them. You walked across the rooftops and dropped into your home through a hole in the ceiling using a ladder. Picture your entire town as one giant rooftop terrace, with everyone climbing down into their living room. They covered their walls with murals, hunting scenes, vultures, and what might be the world's oldest map, or maybe a painting of a nearby volcano erupting. What really stops me is how equal it all seems. No obvious palaces, no grand temples set apart, no houses screaming, "The chief lives here." Every home looks broadly the same. For thousands of years, we've assumed that big settlements automatically need kings and hierarchies and bosses. Çatalhöyük looked at that idea and said, not necessarily. Thousands of people, living jammed together, apparently without rulers. We still don't fully understand how they pulled it off. Number 6. The Indus Valley Civilization. Okay, this one genuinely frustrates me, in the best way. Around 4,500 years ago, across what's now Pakistan and northwest India, there was a civilization as vast and sophisticated as Egypt or Mesopotamia, with cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro holding tens of thousands of people. And these cities were clean. I mean impressively, almost suspiciously clean. They had grid-planned streets laid out on the points of a compass, standardized fired bricks made to the same proportions across hundreds of miles, and, get this, household plumbing and covered sewers running under the streets. They had indoor toilets and drainage that wouldn't be matched in many parts of the world for literally thousands of years. So you'd think we'd know everything about them, right? Wrong. Here's the maddening part. They left writing. Hundreds of little inscriptions, mostly on stamp seal, and we cannot read a single word of it. Nobody has cracked the Indus script. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't even know for certain the names of their kings, or whether they had kings at all. An entire literate civilization of millions of people, and they're staring back at us in total silence. And then, around 3,900 years ago, they faded, possibly as the great rivers shifted and the monsoons weakened. A whole world of plumbing and planning and writing, swallowed by time, refusing to tell us its secrets. Number 5. The Corral Civilization of Peru. We always talk about the cradles of civilization as if there were just a few of them, all huddled in the old world. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, China. But here's something that genuinely thrilled me when I first learned it. Completely independently, with no contact whatsoever with the other side of the planet, people in the Supa Valley of Peru built one of the oldest cities in the entire Americas. Corral. We're talking around 5,000 years ago, meaning Corral was rising at roughly the same time as the Egyptian pyramids. Let that land for a second. While pharaohs were stacking stones along the Nile, people on the coast of Peru were building massive stepped pyramids of their own, with sunken circular plazas and platform mounds, totally unaware that anyone else on Earth exists. And here's the detail I adore. In all of Corral, archaeologists have found almost no weapons, no signs of warfare, no fortifications. Instead, they found flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, and the remains of trade networks stretching to the coast and the rainforest. A great early civilization that seems to have been built around music and commerce rather than war. Corral basically proved that the urge to build cities, to organize thousands of people around grand, shared projects, isn't some one-off accident from the Middle East. It's something in us. It can ignite anywhere, all on its own. Number 4. The megalith builders of the Atlantic coast. Here's a fact that should be way more famous than it is. You know Stonehenge. Everyone knows Stonehenge. But Stonehenge is a relative newcomer. Long before it, all along the western edge of Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, Ireland, Britain, Stone Age farmers were hauling enormous stones into circles, rows, and tombs, and some of these are staggeringly old. The temples of Malta, the standing stones of Karnak in France, where thousands of stones march across the landscape in endless rows, the Great Passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland. Newgrange is the one that gives me chills. It's over 5,000 years old, older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid, and it's not just a pile of rocks. Once a year, on the morning of the winter solstice, and only then, the rising sun threads through a precisely cut opening above the entrance, and a beam of light crawls slowly down a stone passage until it floods the chamber deep inside the mound. These were people without writing, without metal tools, without the wheel in any meaningful sense, and they understood the movement of the sun well enough to build a machine of stone that catches a single sunrise a year. They did it with antler picks and stone hammers and sheer collective will. Whatever they believed about death and rebirth and that returning light, they believed it enough to move mountains. Literally. Number 3. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture. This one almost nobody has heard of, and that's a crime, because what they built is jaw-dropping. Between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, across what's now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, there was a culture that built the largest settlements on the planet at the time, bigger than anything in Mesopotamia in the same era. Some of their megasites sprawled across hundreds of hectares and may have housed 10, 15, possibly 20,000 people. These were arguably among the first true cities on Earth, sitting up in Eastern Europe while most of the world was still in scattered villages. But here's the part that genuinely haunts me. Every so often, every 60 or 80 years or so, they would burn their entire town to the ground, on purpose, the whole thing, and then rebuild it, often right on top of the ashes, or nearby. We're not totally sure why. Maybe ritual, maybe a way of cleansing and renewing the community, maybe something tied to generations and starting fresh. Imagine a society where, roughly once a lifetime, everyone agrees to set fire to everything they've built and begin again. There's something almost philosophical about it, a civilization that refused to let its past pile up. And then, like so many others, they too dissolved into the great silence of prehistory, leaving behind layers of beautifully painted pottery and the burnt foundations of cities the world forgot. Number 2, the Aboriginal Australians. Now, I want you to take everything you think you know about how long a culture can last and throw it out the window. Because the people who walked into Australia did so around 65,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. 65,000. Let me try to make that real for you. The Egyptian pyramids are about 4,500 years old. Stonehenge, 5,000. The cave paintings at Lascaux, 17,000. Aboriginal Australians were already living on their continent more than 3 times longer ago than those famous cave paintings, and they have been there continuously ever since. This is, by a wide margin, the oldest continuous living culture on the entire planet. And to get there in the first place, they did something that should be impossible for that era. They crossed open ocean, sea voyages on boats or rafts, tens of thousands of years before anyone officially should have been sailing. Once there, they developed an extraordinary way of holding knowledge, songlines, oral maps, and stories that encode geography, water sources, law, and history across thousands of kilometers, passed down by voice alone for hundreds of generations. And here's a fact that genuinely stuns me. Some Aboriginal stories appear to describe coastlines that were drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, events from over 10,000 years ago. If that's right, and many researchers think it may be, then these are accurate memories, preserved purely through spoken word, older than every written document on Earth combined. That's not history. That's deep time, kept alive on human breath. And number 1, Göbekli Tepe. If I could send you to one place in the deep past, it would be this hill in southeastern Turkey, because Göbekli Tepe broke the timeline of human history clean in half. Here's the setup. We always told ourselves a comforting story about how civilization began. First, humans learned to farm. Farming gave surplus food. Surplus food gave free time and settled towns. And only then, once people were comfortable and organized, did they get around to building temples and grand monuments. Religion and architecture were supposed to be the dessert at the end of the meal. Göbekli Tepe took that story and set it on fire. Because here, 11,500 years ago, that's around 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 before the pyramids, hunter-gatherers built a colossal complex of massive stone pillars. Some of these T-shaped pillars stand over 5 meters tall and weigh in the tens of tons, carved with vivid reliefs of foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, and wild boar. And the people who quarried, carved, moved, and raised these giants had no metal tools, no wheels, no pottery, no farming, and no writing. None of it. And here's the part that genuinely rearranged my brain. A leading idea among the researchers is that they may have had it backwards, that it wasn't farming that led to the temple. It may have been the temple that led to farming. The theory goes that gathering enough people in one place to build and feast at a site like this created the very pressure that pushed humans to start cultivating grain nearby, just to feed the crowds. In other words, the urge to come together, to build something sacred and shared, something bigger than any one person, may be what dragged us into civilization in the first place. Not hunger, not survival, the need to gather around something meaningful. And then, even stranger, after using it for centuries, they deliberately buried the whole thing under tons of earth, which is the only reason it survived for us to find. Honestly, every time I think about that hill, I feel the floor drop away beneath the entire story. So there they are. If you made it this far, I'd genuinely love to know, which one of these grabbed you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. And if you'd like to keep wandering through the deep past with me, you know what to do. Subscribe, and let's go dig up the next forgotten world together.